Welcome. My name's Winnie and I'm here to introduce Daniele Procida. He is a Django core developer. He works at DVO and lives in Cardiff, where he helps run things like PyDiff, PyCon Namibia and PyCon UK. He's been with various degrees of success: a high school teacher, a company director, a philosophy lecturer, and some other things he does not care to mention. But what really worked was becoming a programmer a few years ago. He's been heavily involved in the international Python, Django open source software communities and have a special interest in open source software development in Africa. Can you please give a warm welcome to Daniele?
Thank you very much, Winnie, and thank you all for being here. Have we got, is there a problem with my, there we are, okay. So that's, I'm Daniele Procida, that's me. I wish that could be my passport photograph, but they won't let me have it because it says, you know, it says that I'm Python software. Very briefly about me. I work for DVO, a Swiss Django company. We do cloud hosting for Python and Django developers who don't want to be DevOps, so come and talk to me about that afterwards. I'm a member of the Django core development team and a board member of the Django Software Foundation. As Winnie mentioned, I've been involved in the Python Africa movement or project, or whatever you want to call it. We've got various conferences, PyCons and communities running, starting in the first one I was involved with was PyCon Namibia in 2015. And last night, because I wasn't jet lagged, I finally got africa.python.org up and running. So if you look at it, you'll be the first people in the world to see it who aren't me. So have a look at that, and it's just an opportunity to introduce the African Python community to the rest of the world. Maybe we'll see some of you at an African PyCon sometime soon. Come and talk to me about that afterwards too. You can find me online, but best of all, just come and talk to me like a normal human being, because I like that best. So everybody knows this, that better documentation will make your project more successful, because you know that when you share your software with the world, especially if it's open source software, you want the world to use it. But many projects and authors fall foul of a very simple principle, that it doesn't matter how good your project is, if the documentation isn't good enough, the world's going to say, thanks very much, I'm going to use something else. So if the documentation is not good enough or doesn't exist, the world will find some other way to solve its problems and consider your way just too much trouble to consider. And maybe if you've got employees, for example, or henchmen, or at the very least sidekicks or something like that, then you can make them use your software. But for those of us who don't have henchmen or sidekicks, we're reliant on people choosing to use the software or not. Even if you can force people to use your software, which of course is the case if you've got the only solution or these people are your employees, they won't use it very well if the documentation isn't that good, or they won't use it very effectively. Now, most people do in fact try to create good documentation. They put an effort into it, and mostly they fail. And it's not because they don't try hard enough or because they don't take it seriously. They do take it seriously and they put a lot of effort into it. Usually it's because they're not doing it in the right way. And what I want to explain in this talk is how you can make your documentation better, not by working harder at it or spending more time on it, but just by doing it in the right way. Because probably you're doing it wrong. Skip over that, because I don't like telling people they're doing things wrong. I don't want to stand here looking like an overweening know-it-all, even if that's what I really am inside. But the right way to do it is actually the easier way to do it. So it's easier to create documentation like that, and it's easier to maintain it. And I don't like the word secrets, but as though somebody were guarding some information, but there are some very simple principles that govern documentation that are very rarely, if ever, spelled out. So they seem to be secret, so they shouldn't be. And I want to spell them out so they stop being secret. So this talk, I promise, will make your documentation more successful. Okay? And by extension, your team or your product or project more successful too. And this is the secret, that there is not one thing called documentation. There are 4 distinct things represented by documentation, and they represent 4 different purposes or functions. And here they are. Don't worry, I'll give you just if you're taking photographs, I'll give you a slide at the end that contains absolutely everything, and then so you can save taking photographs in the meantime. Feel free to take photographs. Anyway, the point is that documentation needs to be explicitly structured around these 4 different functions, each of which requires a distinct mode of writing. Because people working with software need these 4 different kinds of documentation: tutorials, how-to guides, reference material, and discussions at different times in different circumstances. So they all matter and they're all necessary. And they must all be kept distinct and separate from each other. Keeping them distinct in that way is the key to building successful documentation that is also easy to maintain. It saves a lot of effort both for the reader and the author, because it's clear what goes where and what it's trying to do. And it tells the author how to write, or if you're writing something, where you should go, or if you're writing something, how to change it so it properly fits. Instead of what authors struggle with is they're writing something and they're just wondering where to put it and wrestling it into a shape that seems to make sense for the context that it's in. And this takes all that labor away from you, because each part of this structure has a clear and one and only one job. I'll start with tutorials. Now, I'll spend most of my time talking about this because this is the part of documentation that is most rarely done well, and also one of the most, well, no, they're all important, but for people entering a project, this is really important. Tutorials are lessons that take the reader by the hand through a series of steps to complete a project or meaningful exercise of some kind. And it's an exercise like you would do in school, in a class. You do an exercise. You're not doing the real thing, but an exercise. They're what your project needs to show the beginner that they can achieve something meaningful. And their main purpose is just to give the new user the best possible start. And they are learning oriented. That's what their function is, to do something that will enable another person to learn. I used to be a high school teacher, so if you want to talk in the I hope we'll have time for questions. I mean, this concept of learning is poorly understood, especially, well, even within teaching, I can assure you. But outside teaching, the learning is understood even less well. So anyway, my analogies are going to be about food. So think about teaching. Who's taught a young child to cook here? Who's got young children? Yeah, I mean, people at PyCon tend to be a few years younger than me. So, but when you're teaching a child to cook, what you teach the child isn't really important. What's important is that the child finds it enjoyable and gains confidence, and then wants to come back and do it again. And it's through the things that the child does that it will learn the important things about cooking, including all the things that you take for granted, that, you know, for example, that you wash your hands before handling food. So when we learn a new craft or skill, and this is really my only insight of the last couple of years, that technology isn't, we should stop thinking about technology as a matter of machinery and start thinking of technology as craft or skill. Okay? So when we are learning a new craft or skill, we always begin learning it by doing it. And using software like cooking is a matter of skill or craft. It's knowledge, but it's practical knowledge, not theoretical knowledge. And the point of a tutorial is to get your learner started. It's to inspire confidence in them, in themselves, in the kitchen and its tools, in you as a teacher, so they trust you. Without that confidence, you will lose them. A tutorial must be repeatable every single time, in every single circumstance. So it can't just work for your Linux users or your Macintosh users. It has to work for everyone. So you've got to do a lot of work to make that possible. It has to provide an immediate sense of achievement. Every single step when the child is cooking has to produce something that they can recognize as a small success. So they've climbed up a step. They think, okay, I've climbed up a step. Children have short attention spans, and they'll get bored, and that's okay. They will leave the cooking session halfway through the preparation. It doesn't matter, because they've climbed up one step, and they can come back knowing that they'll find that step again easily, and the next time they'll go a little bit further. Even if your learner is not a child, the same thing applies. Tutorials, this is the thing that programmers find hard. Tutorials need to be concrete, not abstract. They deal with the particular, not the general. They're built around specific, particular outcomes and actions. Learning proceeds from the particular and the concrete to the general and the abstract, not the other way around. So do not explain anything in a tutorial that doesn't absolutely need to be explained. Explanation doesn't matter when somebody is learning a new skill. What they need to learn is to do. I'll talk about that later as well. The other things, no distractions. So don't distract your learner with options or choices or alternatives. You're the teacher, and it's your responsibility to provide them with this arc of learning. And you decide what they're going to do. You decide the exercise and how it's going to work and what the outcomes are going to be. So you're creating a little syllabus for them. Anyway, the important thing is that having done your tutorial, your learner, the newcomer to your software, is now in a position to start making sense of the rest of the documentation and the software itself. And most software has really bad or non-existent tutorials. Typically, tutorials that are mixed up with things like how-to guides, which are completely separate. Tutorials are what will turn your learner into a user. And a bad or missing tutorial will mean that your project simply does not acquire new users. They're the hardest part of the documentation to create and maintain, and it takes a lot of practice and effort to get them right. Your project probably right now lacks an adequate or a good tutorial, and you're probably losing users as a result. Even if your tutorial's pretty good, it's still probably not working for some users whom you are losing as a result. Well, we can go on to questions because, yeah, I won't get distracted now. How-to guides. Now, these are the things these get mixed up with tutorials all the time in people's minds and in actual documentation. How-to guides take the reader through a series of steps required to solve a specific real-world common problem. They're recipes or directions to achieve some specific end. For example, how to create a web form, how to plot a three-dimensional data set, how to enable LDAP authentication. So they are problem-oriented. And if you want an analogy, then a recipe is a how-to guide. It's a recipe for preparing a dish, for preparing something to eat. It has a clear defined end, and it addresses a specific question. So the question could be, how do I make a crab salad? Or it could be, I've got these ingredients, what can I do with them? So you've got a problem, the how-to guide or the recipe is your answer to that problem. A how-to guide is an answer to a question that a true beginner who needs the tutorial might not even be able to formulate. In a tutorial, you're the teacher and you know what the problems are, you know what the things are that need to be done and accomplished, and the learner doesn't. So you decide for the learner what they should be doing. It's your responsibility. In the how-to guide, the user now has enough knowledge that they can ask meaningful questions, meaningful technical questions that you can provide the answer to. So that's one important distinction between a tutorial and a how-to guide. These tend to be done fairly well in software documentation, and they're quite fun and easy to write. So a how-to guide contains a list of steps that need to be followed in order, just like a recipe, to get to some end. Unlike in a tutorial, you don't have to start at the very beginning, just at some reasonable starting point. You don't start a recipe telling your user to wash their hands and get a suitable bowl out. How-to guides need to be reliable, but they don't need to be bulletproof in the way that tutorials do. Tutorials need to have this kind of cast iron repeatability. How-to guides have to focus on achieving some practical goal that is going to solve the user's question. It must tell the user the steps they need to get to that end, and anything else is a distraction. It has to address some specific question. How do I do such and such? What can I do with such and such? Again, tutorials don't need to explain. Programmers love explaining things. So they need to shut down this instinct of needing to explain, because explanations have a place, just not here. Explanations get in the way of action. A how-to guide needs a little bit of flexibility, because you might have, the problem might be slightly different, or the use case slightly different, or the ingredients that you've got in the cupboard might be slightly different. So you need a little bit of flexibility, unlike the tutorial. And it must just have enough openness that the user can see how this might be applied to a slightly different case. Maybe you want to make a different kind of mayonnaise, but you can still make sense of that even if you didn't have wasabi. Practical usability is much more important than completeness. We're not trying to solve every problem, we're trying to solve that problem, answer that question. And strangely, good naming helps. So the title of a how-to document that's how to create a class-based view, that's a good title. But creating a title, creating a class-based view, or even class-based views, those are very poor how-to guide titles, because they don't tell the user what's really in there. Class-based views as a title just suggests it might be generally about class-based views, but not about the problem that you're showing the users how to solve. So I hope, if there's one thing that I'd like you to come away with, it's this distinction between tutorials on one hand and how-to guides on the other. So I hope that's a little bit clearer now, but we can ask me, please, at the end if you're in any doubt about that. Reference guides are technical descriptions of the machinery and how to operate it. And they only have one job, and their job is description. They're code determined because ultimately that's what they're describing. They're describing things like key classes and functions and APIs and commands. So in reference material, you'll read things like, a Django model is a Python class. Imagine that in a tutorial, what nonsense that would be for the brand new beginner. A Django model is a Python class. It doesn't mean anything to the beginner. This is how you create a model. These are the available model fields. This is how you instantiate this class. So reference material is information-oriented. where how-to guides are problem-oriented and tutorials are learning-oriented. This is information-oriented. It should list things, describe things like classes, functions, fields, attributes, and methods, and so on. And by all means, you can include examples in your reference material, but it's not the place of reference material to explain basic concepts, because you can assume that people have these basic concepts by the time they get to your reference material. And it shouldn't be trying to explain how to achieve common tasks, because you've got how-to documentation for that. Got it, thanks. So this needs to be austere and to the point. It just should give the reader the facts. So if you want another food analogy, an encyclopedia article about an ingredient. It just tells you about it. It doesn't tell you what to do with ginger or how to grow it. It just tells you stuff about it. What matters in reference material? Things like structure. So your reference documentation should have the same structure as the code base, because that's what it's describing. So people can navigate through the code base and through the documentation in the same way, and this isomorphism helps them keep them in the right place. Consistency. You want consistency of language and tone and structure, as consistent as those in a dictionary. And this is actually quite a difficult thing to achieve. It's, it's taken us a long time to work out how to write consistent dictionaries and encyclopedias over the years. But that's what we're aiming for in documentation. The only job is the description of machinery as clearly and completely as possible. Anything else, explanation, discussion, instruction, speculation, opinion, is a distraction and will make it harder to use and maintain. And of course, these descriptions must be accurate and kept up to date, because any discrepancy between the machinery and the description will lead the user astray. Now, some developers, this is the only kind of documentation they can imagine writing, because they already understand the stuff. They think that people just want information. But of course, people need also to learn to solve problems, as well as the information that's provided here. If you don't provide space for those other things, they're going to end up in your reference material and make your reference material less effective. And lastly, discussions, which I think is probably I think I should call this background or something like that, or background or explanations. Anyway, let's not get hung up on that. I don't mean, by discussions, I don't mean people talking backwards and forwards. I simply mean discussion of a topic, background material on a topic. Discussions are explanations that clarify and illuminate a particular topic, and they are understanding-oriented. They're a chance for the documentation to relax a little bit and step back from the software to take a wider view. So again, here's my analogy, a book that includes historical, sociological, scientific, and other background discussion of food and cooking. You should read this book if you haven't got it. It's very interesting. Harold McGee on food and cooking. So they're the place for background and context. For example, web forms and how they are handled in Django, or search and Django CMS. They can explain why things are the way they are. Design decisions, historical reasons. They can consider alternatives, maybe multiple different approaches to the same question. So in the Django documentation, we discuss multiple different options for deployment. And you can even bring in, you can even consider and weigh up contrary and conflicting opinions. For example, whether tests should be in a package directory or not. They should make connections between different things for the context that help the reader make sense of the subject and see how it stands in relationship to other things that they already know about. But it's not the place for any kind of instruction or any kind of technical description. They're less easy to create than it might seem, because it's very easy to write a how-to, because you've got the goal. How do I do such and such? So you know what you're aiming for. When you're writing a discussion document, a background document, you're staring at a blank page, and then you have to put something on it. So here are the 4 quadrants of software documentation. And I'm arguing that as soon as the characteristics of one of these quadrants starts appearing in another, the quality of the documentation as a whole will start to decline. In other words, if you add new material to the documentation, but you add it in the wrong place, you're going to make your documentation worse, not better, by adding more material. It'll be less useful for the reader, and it'll be harder for the author to maintain. You'll literally be incurring technical debt. So that's what it will look like if you don't manage to keep these things apart. And it is hard to keep them apart, and that's because of the way in which all these characteristics of documentation overlap. So here they are, neatly in their own quadrant. That looks really nice photo, and think, oh yeah, okay, I can do that. But tutorials and how-to guides are very similar because they're both concerned with giving the user practical steps. But on the other hand, how-to guides and reference material are what they share with each other is that they're what we need by our side when we're actually at work doing the coding, sitting in front of the computer. Whereas references and discussion or background material are concerned with theoretical rather than practical knowledge. And what tutorials have in common with discussions is that they're most useful when we are studying the material rather than actually in the business of doing the coding. So there's this kind of gravitational pull between all these quadrants, and no wonder it ends up looking like that. There are tensions inherent in this, and they're pulling each other together. So your job as a documentation writer is to resist those inward tensions and that temptation to allow these things to blur. Now you can get your phones out, okay? Because this is, this is what it really should look like. And when you've got it like this, you will have documentation that works, that is easier to write and to maintain, that's easier to use and find your way around in. And it won't write itself, but you'll have a much clearer idea of what to write, how to write it, and where to put it. And your users will be served better. Because for all the different phases in the cycle of their interaction with your software, they will find the right kind of material for whatever it is that they are doing at that moment that serves the need of that moment. And your software will attract and keep more users who can use it more effectively, which is what you want after all. There are plenty of, well, there are a few examples of this. I mean, it's there in the Django documentation. Oh, by the way, it's really important, I think, to explicitly spell this out. So although when I looked at the Django documentation, I saw that actually this structure exists, it didn't actually spell it out. So I put that in there. And I always put that in any documentation I'm writing so that nobody will mess it up in the future. Django CMS, another project I'm involved in, we do exactly the same thing. And I've seen other people start to adopt it, which is really nice. Other projects, I mean, here they've got tutorials split into two sections, so that's fine, but we've still got tutorials, how-to guides, reference material, and background. So it's the same structure. So there it is again. I've written it all up, so you can go and have a look at that. I don't know if anybody needs to take photographs of that. But have we got time for a few questions? So if we have, there's me. Come and talk to me. And thank you very much for your time and attention.
I feel like maybe you just described in perfect form what constantly goes wrong with project wikis and company internal intranet wikis. I wonder if you can shed any light on how you might beat those into better shape when you've already got a mishmash of all of that mixed together in disorganized random editor page wiki form.
Well, I used to be a high school teacher, and beating is frowned upon. And you know, it's even hard to keep henchmen for a long time if you deliver beatings. So it's getting people to internalize this, especially when they're faced with the temptations of something like a wiki, which is just an invitation to toss things in there, is very difficult. So what I do is I say, I'm reorganizing the documentation and just do it. So it's very difficult to prevent the leakage from happening. Wikis are really bad at it, but other documentation tools like restructured text are much better, because when you've got that spelled out at the start of the documentation, then it helps maintain it a lot. So yeah, it is hard, and it's constant maintenance work. Yeah, not so easy.
I think time's up, but I'm sure Danielle will be around if you've got more questions or tweet him. Yep.
Please do
Or
come and
Slack or
anything. Come and talk to me, or here's some contact details. So thank you once again.